Jake hadn't planned on becoming a lighthouse keeper. Once a city electrician with nothing but the constant hum of wires and fluorescent lights for company, he'd left it all behind after a bitter divorce and a string of dead-end jobs. When the small, isolated position at Windward Point Lighthouse popped up on a regional job board, it seemed like the perfect escape. A place to be alone with the crashing waves, the cold sea air, and the ceaseless wind. Windward Point was more myth than destination. The lighthouse itself sat on a craggy, jagged cliff overlooking the tumultuous Pacific Ocean, a lonely sentinel that had guarded the rocky coast for over a century. The automated beacon still shone its steady beam, warning ships of the dangerous shoals below, but the Maintenance Trust Fund required a live keeper at least part of the year, a condition Jake was happy to fill. The only access was a rickety fishing boat from Port Harrow, a town of less than 1,000 souls tucked into the Oregon coastline, known mostly for its grizzled fishermen and salty air. The ride out was rough, with waves lashing against the hull and spray flying. The first time Jake saw Windward Point from the water, the lighthouse looked like a lonely watchtower from another era. Weathered stone walls stained with salt and age, surrounded by thorny bushes and jagged rocks. Jake's first weeks passed in a routine of maintenance, climbing the spiral stairs to clean the lantern lens, oiling the ancient gears, patching up cracked windows, and making sure the diesel generator hummed steadily through the long nights. The solitude was a balm. No co-workers to answer to, no traffic jams, just him and the sea. But slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with the sounds. At first, Jake noticed the faintest of whispers drifting over the cliffs at night, carried by the wind like distant voices or conversations just out of earshot. He told himself it was the ocean, waves crashing and water pulling over stones, playing tricks on his mind. The isolation made every sound sharper, every shadow deeper. One evening, while inspecting the generator room, Jake noticed something strange. The light's rotation was stuttering. Instead of the smooth, steady sweep of the beacon, the beam jerked and hesitated. Curious, he climbed to the beacon room and carefully opened the mechanism. Inside, tangled among the gears, was a mass of seaweed and driftwood, slimy and clinging. How had it gotten in? The windows and doors were sealed tight, and the ocean never reached that high up the tower. The next night, the beacon stopped rotating altogether for nearly 15 minutes. Jake rushed to the lighthouse top and found muddy footprints scattered across the floor. They were barefoot prints, small and wet, leading from the window and trailing off toward the cliff edge, vanishing into the darkness. No boat had come, no one had visited. At least, none that the town had reported. Jake's unease deepened, but he rationalized it. Fishermen, maybe kids from town sneaking out, or even other lighthouse staff playing a prank. Yet, there was no evidence, no boats or signs of anyone having landed. One night, the foghorn suddenly blared for several minutes, shaking the walls of the lighthouse. Jake ran to the controls, but the switches were untouched and the generator was running normally. Outside, the wind howled, but there was something else. A low, guttural moan rolling off the rocks below. Standing at the cliff's edge, he saw her. A woman, standing motionless on the jagged rocks, her dress tattered and soaked, hair wild and clinging to her face. She was staring out to the endless dark sea, pale in the ghostly moonlight. Jake called out. No answer. He took a step forward, and she vanished, swallowed by the thick mist. From that night, the sightings became frequent. Sometimes she stood on the cliff, other times just visible from the lighthouse window, a shadow watching from the rocks. Jake found strange offerings on the doorstep: seashells, bits of coral, and once a small carved wooden figurine of a bird. The townsfolk of Port Harrow whispered of old legends. A woman named Eliza who had worked at the lighthouse in the 1920s. She was said to be the assistant keeper, a young woman who vanished during a terrible storm. Her body never recovered. Some said she drowned. Others believed she'd walked off the cliff in despair. Jake dove into local archives and old newspaper clippings, piecing together the tale. The lighthouse had once been manned by a small crew, but the harsh isolation had driven many to madness or worse. Eliza was the last assistant before the automation took over. One night, a violent storm lashed Windward Point. Thunder shook the walls and rain battered the windows. Jake was lying in his cot when the door to the beacon room slammed shut with a force that shook dust against the brick walls. Not the wooden door or the windows, but the solid stone itself, as if someone was tapping just beyond the plaster. Jake lay frozen, heart pounding, until the sound stopped. The next morning, the small wooden box he'd noticed earlier, covered in moss and salt, was gone from its place in the maintenance closet. The door, which he was sure had been locked, now hung ajar. He knew then he was not alone. On the final night of his contract, Jake heard footsteps climbing the spiral staircase. Slow, measured steps, but when he called out, no one answered. The light flickered and dimmed. Outside, the foghorn wailed. Standing by the cliff, looking out to sea, Jake caught a glimpse of her once more. The woman in the tattered dress, her eyes meeting his. "Keep the light burning," she whispered, her voice carried on the wind. Jake left Windward Point the next morning, but the lighthouse's grip never fully loosened. He still felt the weight of the unseen presence, the cold brush of a hand on his back, the whisper of voices in the salt wind. The sea keeps its secrets, and some places are meant to be left alone.